Hello and welcome. My name is Carrie Feely, and I am the Assistant Dean for Admissions and International Programs at the College of Law here at Michigan State University. Thank you for joining us today. We are excited to tell you more about the Dual JD program with the University of Ottawa. I am going to attempt to field questions as much as possible during the presentation. So if you have questions, feel free to type them to us. And we will do our best. If not, we'll certainly take questions as well at the end. With that said, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the background of the College of Law's program and the reason why it is such a natural fit here. The College of Law has had a program now with the University of Ottawa for about 15 years, and that really started because Michigan State University and the state of Michigan are so close geographically to Ontario, and so it was a very natural fit for us to reach out to such a prestigious university in Canada to think about ways in which we could better serve not only our Canadian students, but also American students who wanted to practice potentially in different parts of Canada. So we have had the program. It's been quite successful. Last year we had, as in past years, about 7 students in the program. In past years there's been as many as 12. We anticipate that that will be pretty level for the next couple of years. And so we're excited that you are interested in the program and recognize that it's a true benefit to the students involved to participate in this program. So I want to talk about a couple of things today, one of which is the benefits of doing a dual degree program, and specifically the dual degree with the University of Ottawa. I want to talk as well, as we talk about those benefits, about how that's going to help you in the job market, as well as what happens if you decide that you don't want to do a dual degree and you would instead rather just get a JD at MSU Law? How would you become a licensed attorney in the various provinces in Canada? I then want to talk about what happens if you decide to stay in Canada for law school and then to seek a degree at a U.S. law school. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our advanced standing program, just very briefly, which would be a way to earn a JD at MSU Law after first getting a JD at a Canadian law school or a different law degree at a Canadian law school. So with that said, let's talk briefly about the benefits of getting a dual degree. So the biggest thing, right, is that you can broaden your marketability. You are expanding your skill set to beyond just the legal profession by learning more about the American market and certainly American business and American culture while you're here. And for the American students who are going to Canada, the same thing. You're learning more about the workings of another country and expanding your job capabilities and also your marketability as a result. That said, you also are going to be, of course, doubling your legal knowledge, right? You'll have legal knowledge from 2 different countries, which to many firms and agencies is a critical thing, especially here in Michigan, again, given our proximity to Canada, and certainly throughout Canada, given the proximity to various states in the U.S., having knowledge of both the U.S. and the Canadian legal fields to answer those legal questions is really very critical. Right now here in Michigan, we're dealing with a number of issues that involve trade with Canada, bridge to Canada and transportation to and from Canada, border issues, immigration issues, and that's true across the border and throughout both countries. So lots of benefit to knowing what immigration looks like on either side of the border, especially right now with political climate as it is. That's very true. What's happening with NAFTA currently, and how does the law impact that as it relates to trade? So lots of things I think are a benefit of going to law school in 2 different countries. So a dual degree would allow you to basically take a predetermined number of credits from each program and count those electives toward electives in the other program. So you're shortening the amount of time needed to complete the 2 combined degrees. If you're considering doing this program, remember that you'll need to apply and be accepted into each of the programs separately. So when it comes to doing a dual degree at the University of Ottawa and Michigan State, if you wanted to apply on the Michigan State side first, what you would do is apply to us, and then during the first year or your second year here, you would also apply to the University of Ottawa, and you would be essentially accepted first to Michigan State and then accepted while you're a student here to Ottawa. The same is true in reverse as well, that if you decide to start in Ottawa, you would do your first 2 years there, and during that time apply to Michigan State, and then be accepted into each program separately. So let's keep moving through here and talk about the dual degree specifically with the University of of Ottawa, and sort of how the program logistically works. So what you're going to be doing is earning 2 different law degrees in the course of 4 years. So essentially what will happen is that you will live and study for 2 years in each country while you are preparing to practice law in both countries. So if you started here in Michigan, you would spend 2 years here, and then you would move to Canada for 2 years and study at the University of Ottawa. You would, of course, have visa processes to go through depending on which side you start on. If you start on the Michigan State side, you would need to have a study visa called it's actually an I-20, which is part of the visa process. So you would need to get an I-20 to come and study here for the 2 years and have the funding to study here for the 2 years. The same is true if you are coming from the U.S. First, as an American citizen or permanent resident, you would need to get a Canadian study permit to finish out the program while in Ottawa. So when you are done with the program after those 4 years, you cannot go back and forth, by the way. So you couldn't start in the U.S., go to Canada, come back to the U.S., then return to Canada. You need to do 2 years here and then 2 years there, or vice versa. So 2 years in each place at a time. When you're done, the goal is that you could take the bar exam in any U.S. state because you have your JD from MSU, and you could also take the Canadian Barrister's exam. All right, so with the dual degree program, in terms of applying then to the University of Ottawa, most students do start on the MSU Law side and then go to Ottawa after that, so in their 3rd year, but there are students as well who certainly do start on the Ottawa side and end up at Michigan State. But let's talk about how it works if you're coming from Michigan State and then going to Ottawa. So again, as I mentioned earlier, you start your JD at MSU Law and you then apply to the Canadian and American Dual JD program in the spring of either your 1L or your 2L year. So 1L being the first year of law school, 2L being the second year of law school. When we are talking about the application process, one thing that students always ask is, how do my grades factor into this in terms of deciding when I can apply or when I should apply? You need to be in the top 50% of your class to be accepted by the University of Ottawa. So if you know after your first semester in law school that you are not in the top 50%, you would want to wait until the second year in order to be able to do that. If you know that you're in the top 50%, you could apply in your first year and be accepted. All of the acceptances, though, are conditional, meaning that they're conditioned upon 2 years being in the top 50%, or rather being in the top 50% at the end of those 2 years, I should say, and making sure that academically you are ready to go. You've met all the requirements here for graduation. So you would need to kind of time things out that way, depending on what your grades are in your first year, depending on your certainty in terms of whether or not you want to participate in the program. Those are some of the things that would impact your timeline. But you can apply in your first year or your second year, or you could apply in your first year and be denied and apply again in your second year. That certainly is an option as well. So I see that there is a question about specific interest in criminal law and what the dual training would look like. Jessica, what I'm going to do is have you email our admissions account with your question, and I will forward that to our academic advisors, and they would be able to give you, I think, a really good rundown of what that would look like in terms of not only the courses here at Michigan State, but also then at the University of Ottawa, and tell you a little bit about some of the students who are currently in the program who have a criminal law interest. One of the things that I think is critical to remember and to point out, certainly, is that because you are abbreviating your time at either place, some of the things that might be critical to you would not be things that you could participate in. So for instance, here at Michigan State, we have something called the Trial Practice Institute. The Trial Practice Institute is meant for people who are interested in litigation, and people who are interested in litigation sometimes are also interested in criminal law. And for those people, because of the limited time that you have here, you would not have enough time to participate in that program because it requires you to be here in your 3L or your 3rd year. There are clinical programs here as well, where because of the tight timing, you'd really have to time things out and work with an advisor to make sure that you could fit those things in an appropriate way without messing up the timeline that you need to then start at the University of Ottawa. So depending on what you want to do and what you want to specialize in, doing the dual degree may or may not be the best option for you. And what I would encourage you to do is, whether it's criminal law or something else, is to talk to an advisor here and talk to the advisor at the University of Ottawa. I'm happy to put you in touch to say, what would my program look like if these are my interests and I did the dual degree? And what would my program look like if I just did a JD at either institution? And then to determine what makes sense for you given your interest. So again, really depends on what it is that you want to do and whether or not the dual degree meets those interests. I also see the question about internships and externships. That's a great question, and I'm going to address it in just a few minutes as we talk about some of the career aspects of things. So finishing out then our discussion of the application process, which is critical, one of the things that I would also encourage you to think about is the CVIS implications. So if you are a Canadian student coming to the US for law school, you will need to, as I said, get permission from the government to come and study here. We have something called CPT, which is curricular practical training, and something called OPT, which is optional practical training. They're two very different things. CPT, which is the first mention I made, curricular practical training, is when you get permission from our CVIS, or CVIS is a division of Homeland Security, so really our immigration agency here in the US. They give you permission to essentially earn money while you're here and while you're a student working outside of campus, which is something that you're ordinarily not allowed to do. Ordinarily, if you're an international student on a college, university campus, professional school campus, you can only work on that campus and only for a limited number of hours. CPT opens up an opportunity for you to go work at a law firm or to go work for a judge or to do something else outside of any campus job opportunities. CPT is available to you either during, before, or after a specific course, and you have to prove a link to the course between the course that you're talking about and then whatever it is that you want to do in terms of your career development. So let's say that you took a course in litigation and you did a CPT experience just afterward, working at a firm that does a lot of litigation. You would do your CPT, and it's something where you could even be paid by that firm, when again, ordinarily you couldn't. So that's something very specialized. That's not really going to be impacted by doing the dual degree program because it's linked to a course here. And as a result, you would normally have the time to be able to do that. The only change in terms of doing the program and being able to do CPT would be that if you wanted to stay the summer afterward, after your second year here, you would need to make sure that you coordinate with our CVIS coordinator and with your advisor to make sure that your enrollment status stays at the appropriate level for you to be able to stay here and do that job. But again, that's not the main concern. The bigger concern that our Canadian students have is that when you do the dual degree, after your second year, you then go to Ottawa and you cannot come back to do what we call OPT, which is optional practical training. As I mentioned, it's 1 year of training related to your degree or a job related to your degree. So let's say that you, again, criminal law interest, you do your 4 years and you really want to get experience at a US firm afterward. You would not be able to do that after going back to Canada for 2 years. You would lose that opportunity as a part of your student visa status, and you would have to find another way to make that happen by getting another type of visa. So that is a hurdle in the sense that if you do a 3-year degree here, you would still be eligible to do that 1 year, and you could essentially add a 4th year of what it kind of equates to articling. If you're familiar with articling in the Canadian sense, that's essentially what we're talking about here, is some practical training, right? In this case, you're allowed to work or volunteer or to have another year in the US that is linked to your degree. It's got to be linked to law. So it would not be something where you get a law degree and then you can go work in a business company doing sales calls. It has to be something linked to your degree. But if you do the dual degree and you start at MSU, then go to Ottawa, you would lose that OPT option, which is frustrating for some students. But for some students, worth it in the sense that they wanted to do the dual degree and are willing to lose that option. So moving on in terms of how it works. As I discussed, when students do the program, they can start in either location. One of the key things to remember is that where you start is where you pay for the entire time. So if you start at MSU Law, you would pay us the entire time as opposed to paying the University of Ottawa, even when you're taking courses at Ottawa. You would start here and you would pay what equates to 3.5 years of tuition as opposed to 4, because you're adding that 4th year. That 4th year becomes discounted on the MSU Law side. If you start in Ottawa, you will pay Ottawa even for the time that you're here. So payment works in that way. You pay where you start. As I said, have to spend 2 years in each institution chronologically, so you can't skip back and forth, and you have to fulfill the graduation requirements of both MSU and then the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Law. With that said, if you are interested in the common law faculty or in the civil law faculty, if you're interested in doing the program in French in Ottawa, all of those are options to you, and those are things that are on the application that the University of Ottawa provides. Of course, here we only provide the degree in English. So students in the Dual JD program transfer up to 29 credits from Ottawa that transfer back here to satisfy our requirement for the 88 degree credits needed to graduate, and they, of course, accept our credits as transfer credits toward their degree. And so that is how academically it works. This is going to get a little bit into the weeds, and I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but I want to make sure that you're aware of what the graduation requirements look like on the MSU Law side. And they're very similar on the Ottawa side. So to earn a JD at MSU Law, you have to do the following things. You have to take 88 hours of credit. 65 of those have to be in what we call regularly scheduled class sessions. So they can't be online, right? There's a limit on what you can take online. You have to have a 2.0 or better. Law schools tend to have a little bit lower GPAs required to stay in good standing than other graduate programs because the grading scales are different. So that seems really low, right, to have a C or better as what's required, but that's because, again, we're not on a grad school curve, which is generally, 80% of people or so getting A's and B's. We're on a very different curve system. Obviously, you'd have to take all the mandatory courses, and you'd have to do what we call the upper level writing requirement, or the ULWR, which is essentially kind of a mini thesis. Okay. This other detail here basically means that you couldn't be a transfer student, transferring credits in from another institution to MSU Law and then trying to transfer those into the Dual JD program. So you couldn't be a transfer student participating in this program. You have only 7 years to complete all the requirements, and of course you've got to pay your bills. So those are kind of the basics, right? And again, very similar on the Ottawa side, different courses that are required. There's a lot of redundancy in what's offered, given that we're both common law countries. So what you're going to find is that the required courses are generally the ones on either side when they can't be transferred, generally the things that are country specific. So Introduction to Canadian Law or American Constitutional Law. Those are things that you must take in the appropriate country as opposed to being able to transfer them in. So that's the program and how you get into it. I want to talk next about the legal market. Again, very, very critical, right? So job statistics that are provided by the University of Ottawa, actually just yesterday in a presentation, they met with students who are thinking about starting next year, show something critical, which is that there are more Canadian law graduates than traditional legal jobs. Now, it's not as though there are 50 graduates for every job that's out there. It's that the types of law jobs that are out there are changing, right? We're not seeing as many traditional legal jobs, so firms, government, things like that. What we are seeing more of, just as we are in the States, are more non-traditional jobs, what we call JD Advantage, or more creative type legal jobs. So jobs where having a JD is important, but it's not necessarily essential, right? So this dual JD, if you do it, would give you greater flexibility in your job search, and it's also going to make you very unique in the eyes of your employers. So let's say that you go to, for instance, TD Bank in Toronto, and you walk in and you've got a JD from the University of Ottawa. That's an amazing degree. Ottawa is an amazing school. If you walk in with a degree from Michigan State, the same thing. It's a very good school. If you walk in with degrees from both schools, it shows something to them that they're not seeing from other candidates, which is that you have background from both institutions. You have studied law at both institutions. You have the potential to become licensed in both countries, and you understand the differences and the nuances between two similar yet very different systems. So you might find yourself to be a better candidate to a company like that than somebody who has only one law degree. So our graduates are working throughout Canada. I was at a reception in September and met with about 12 of them who are in Ontario. They're working in banks. They're working in firms. They're certainly working in government. We have one who is a prosecutor in the London, Ontario area. So people are doing lots of different things with this degree, right? Which is great to know. Some of these things are things that they could have done without the dual degree, and some things are things that they can only do because of the dual degree. So it's provided a flexibility, I think, for a lot of our alums. But let's talk about what happens if you decide only to come to Michigan State and you either don't get into the dual degree program or you don't apply to it. You can apply to become, or you can practice in Canada with the US JD, but you need to go through the Canadian NCA, which is the National Committee on Accreditation process, first. So here's the basic steps. It's a lot more complicated than this, and so I'm only going to go through the basics, but I wanted to give you at least some understanding of what this looks like. So when you go through the NCA process, what you will be doing is submitting to them everything about your foreign legal education. So they would need to look at your transcripts, potentially more than that, right? I've heard of a couple times when students who are Canadian and have a JD from here having to provide, let's say, a course outline or other things. Not all the time, but certainly they want to know that they can vet your education and figure out what you've taken here. Because what they're going to do using that is determine what additional coursework, if any, you have to take at a Canadian law school in order to become licensed in your province. So if you got a JD here, you might need to take Introduction to the Canadian Legal System, or you might need to take Canadian Constitutional Law, right? Things like that, where you would not have gotten that content in the US, and it's sufficiently different that you would need the Canadian version of it, not the US, in order to be an effective attorney or barrister in Canada. You may or may not, probably will, need to take various tests via the NCA in Canada. Once this is all complete and you've wrapped that process up, the NCA would then issue a certificate that would show your eligibility to practice law in Canada, and you would then go through provincial process to become licensed in whatever province you want to practice in. Some students find that this process doesn't take very much time, maybe a month or two. For some students, it takes more. It really depends on what they take when they're here. So if you decide not to do the dual JD program, which ensures that you can practice in either country, what you'd want to do is to meet with advisors at the end of your first year. Everything in your first year here is going to be required, so you can't change your coursework. But at the end of your first year, when you're registering for your second year, what you would want to do is to work with an advisor to think through and certainly even consult with the NCA folks to say, what can I take to put me in the best position to practice in Canada, right? To have the least time needed to take courses at a Canadian law school or do other things. One thing that some students do is go home to Canada and get an LLM, which answers that whole issue for the NCA. But a lot of students don't want to put in that investment. So unless that's something you absolutely know that you'd want to do, it would be good to talk to an advisor here to figure out what that would look like if you just did the USJD. And there are reasons to do that, whether it's to do clinics or to do the Trial Practice Institute or to participate in other things here or for other reasons. You'll want to make sure that you know what it would look like on the NCA side. I wanted to go back quickly to a discussion that relates to careers, which is internships and externships. So we work with the Ottawa version of our Career Services Office, and their advisor, their name's Kelly, and we work with her and our Career Services Office to make sure that students who are planning to do the dual JD have access to the listings for externships and internships. They have a summer, it's the equivalent of an externship program there. So we work with them to make sure that you are looped into opportunities and to make sure that you have sufficient time to apply for things that you might be interested in doing there. So while you're here, you would potentially do an externship after your first summer. Most students don't have paid internships after their first summer, although it's possible. But let's say you did an externship, you would then do some sort of a CPT experience, potentially your second summer, or you'd go home to Canada and do something there for the summer via either or both schools, and then you'd start your third year in Ottawa and then take the train, from there into their opportunities as it relates to externships and internships. But the two departments work together pretty closely to make sure that the Canadian students and the American students who are in the dual JD program have access to opportunities at both schools. So that communication is certainly there. And Jessica, let me know if that didn't answer your question. So the other option, and this is one that may or may not be the right choice for you, again, depending on what you want to do. If you decide to start law school in Canada, it may be that at a later date you say, I really wish that I were also licensed in the US. Now, you can certainly go through a bar and try to become licensed. You have to have a significant number of years of practice in some jurisdictions in order to become licensed. So the other thing that you could do if you wanted to would be to essentially transfer some of your Canadian credits to the what we call the Advanced Standing JD program. So you could transfer up to 29 credits or 1 year of your Canadian degree to our JD, and then you would take 2 more years here to actually get your JD. So you'd have your Canadian JD, and then you'd add on to that an additional 2 years, taking into account those transfer credits, and you would then become a JD student. So you'd end up kind of in the same place. You would certainly lose the dual degree distinction of being able to complete that in 4 years, but it is an option after the fact if you decide not to do it. And I'm not going to go into great detail here, but essentially, again, not all 29 credits will necessarily be accepted. I think with Canadian schools, there's a better bet that that will be the case than with some other countries that are not common law countries. But the maximum that you could transfer in would be 29 credits, and that's something that is an accreditation issue for us to do the American Bar Association. So if you decided to do that, you would apply just as you would to the JD normally, except you would apply to the Advanced Standing JD program as opposed to the JD program itself. So those are some various options on how you could practice internationally between the U.S. and Canada. You could do the dual degree program with the University of Ottawa. You could do the 3-year JD here, and then you could do the NCA process, or you could finish your degree in Canada and then come to the U.S. and do, again, what we call an Advanced Standing JD. So I know that's a lot of information. I would be very happy to answer questions. So feel free to type them in. We'll stay on just for a few more minutes longer, and I will answer your questions. I also want to point out while we're here that there are additional webinars coming up, as you can see here on the screen. We have the clinics, legal R&D, and experiential learning at MSU Law will be on Wednesday, January 9th at noon. Our Michigan Leadership Initiative will be at noon on January 15th. That would not be something that you as Canadian students would necessarily be able to participate in. It's for people who have a strong link to Michigan, but if you have a strong link to Michigan, certainly you could consider joining us for that. We'll also have one again later in January about financing your legal education, one in February, the very beginning of February, about getting into law school, and then the final one in February is about the Trial Practice Institute. Thank you, Orlando, for the kind comment. Any other questions out there? So I would, as you're typing potentially any final questions, I would strongly encourage you, if you can, to come to campus for a visit. Talk to me. I manage the program with Ottawa. Talk to another advisor. Talk to current students in the program, because you will get a lot of really, really great information from them. The current president of our Canadian Law Student Association, her name is Kaylee. She and the other students in the program would also be thrilled and very, very happy to hear from you and answer your questions. They've just put together a student guide to the Ottawa program. Again, it's a student guide, so it's not necessarily something that the administration has prepared, right? So you need to kind of take it with a grain of salt, not because it's inaccurate, but because if things have changed, it doesn't necessarily reflect that. But it talks a lot about the student experience. So housing and travel, and what is it like to get an I-20, and what do you really do with your career, and how can you link up with alumni? Those are all things that I would really encourage you to think about doing, again, coming to campus, or at least sending them an email. And if that's something that you wanted to do, just email our admissions account. It's admiss@law.msu.edu. We put it up on the screen here so you've got it. Email us and we will put you in touch for sure. And I'd be happy to talk to you individually as well if you have more questions about the program. Ashley, I see your question here. Yes, we do have students who, I can't think of anybody who's been married. I know that we have students who are engaged. I don't know about married. I think most of the students are probably not married, but certainly you absolutely could. There'd be no question that you could. What you would do if you brought a spouse to the U.S. is they would get what's called a dependent I-20, and that simply means that they're attached to you in terms of their SEVIS record. They would not be able to work while they're here. They could go to school. They could get their own study visa, and I'd be happy to talk to you more about that or to connect you to our SEVIS advisor. But you certainly could participate if you were married. That'd be no problem at all. I just can't think of anybody offhand. We will also be having some events in Canada coming up. I was in Toronto in September and then in Vancouver later that month. We will be back in the Toronto area in April, and we will be putting together some dinners with alumni as well in Toronto, hopefully Vancouver, and Ottawa. So we would love to have you show up and talk to students, talk to alums, and learn more about the program. Any other questions? All right. Well, I'm going to stop the share now of this presentation. Again, feel free to email me, email our office. I hope that we will see you for a visit. If you decide to apply and you're admitted, we do offer some limited funds to help students travel to Michigan. So please make sure that you apply for travel, what we call travel stipends, and that will help hopefully cover some of the costs of getting here from Canada. You can come in on a tourist visa if you need a visa, or you can simply just cross the border without a visa if you don't need one to come to a campus visit. So I hope that we'll see you on campus. I hope to meet all of you in person. Thanks for joining me today, and I hope to see your applications soon. Thank you.